My name is Rachel Monroe. I am 42 years old. I have a master's degree in public health. I run an organisation that has trained over 8,000 community health workers across 14 states, and I own a home in Portland, Oregon that I bought with money I earned from work that my mother spent 15 years telling me was not a real career. Last April, I sat in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., while a senator from the state of Oregon read my name from a podium and presented me with a national award for community health innovation. And I thought about my mother standing in our kitchen in 1998, when I was 17 years old, and telling me that helping people for a living was a lovely idea for a hobby, but not a plan for a life. She was in the audience in that ballroom in Washington. She had flown from Houston to be there. And when the senator finished speaking, and the room began to applaud and I walked to the podium to receive the award, I saw my mother's face in the third row, and what was on it was not the complicated mixture of pride and distance that had characterized most of our adult relationship. It was simply pride, direct and undefended, the kind that belongs to a person who has finally stopped protecting herself from being moved. I gave my speech. I thanked the people who deserved to be thanked. And then I came down from the podium and walked to the third row, and my mother stood up and she held me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment because what needed to be said had been said over the previous 25 years in the accumulation of choices I had made, and the distance those choices had created, and the slow, difficult work of crossing that distance without losing what had been worth protecting. This is the story of those 25 years. I am going to tell you all of it. My mother Patricia grew up in a small town in East Texas in the 1950s and 1960s, which is a context I am going to ask you to hold on to throughout this story because it explains a great deal about the framework she brought to her understanding of what a life should look like and what a daughter should aspire to. Her family were sharecroppers who had worked their way into the black middle class over 2 generations through a combination of the GI Bill, education, and the particular discipline of people who had learned that stability was not guaranteed and had to be maintained by constant effort. Her father was a high school principal. Her mother taught elementary school. Education was the family's currency and the family's armour, and the forms of education that counted were the ones that led to the recognised professions: medicine, law, teaching, accounting. Her parents had worked too hard and too long to produce a daughter whose ambitions were ambiguous. Ambiguity was a luxury. Clarity was safety. When my mother married my father Thomas, a postal worker who was steady and kind and completely unambitious in the professional sense, her parents accepted it because he was stable, and stability was the thing. When my father died of a heart attack at 43, and my mother was left with 2 children and a postal worker's survivor benefits, she rebuilt by returning to school for a bookkeeping certificate and getting a job at a law firm downtown. And she rebuilt with the same determination her parents had built with, and the same conviction that the path to security was narrow and well marked, and you did not deviate from it. I was 12 when my father died. I watched my mother rebuild. I understood, in the way that children understand things before they have the vocabulary for them, that she was building a wall around the family, and that the wall was made of practicality, and that the wall was also a grief response, and also a love response, and also the accumulated weight of a family that had survived too much, uncertainty to afford more. I am telling you all of this because I do not want you to understand my mother as a villain. She is not a villain. She is a woman shaped by what shaped her, the way we all are. I decided I wanted to work in public health at 17, which is an unusual age to make a decision that specific, and which I arrived at through an experience that was specific and formative in the way that some experiences are. My brother Marcus was 15 when he was diagnosed with asthma, the serious kind that required an emergency room visit twice in 2 months and a specialist referral that our insurance covered only partially, and a medication regimen that my mother managed with the precision she applied to everything. What I noticed during that period was not just my brother's illness. What I noticed was the system around the illness, the way the information was distributed or not distributed, the way our neighbourhood had no paediatric specialist within reasonable distance, the way the families around us who had similar situations, but less of my mother's organisational skill, were navigating the same system with fewer tools and worse outcomes. I started asking questions. I talked to the school nurse. I talked to a community health educator who came to our school to do an asthma awareness presentation. I stayed after to ask her questions, and she stayed for 45 minutes answering them, and at the end she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "You're asking exactly the right questions. That means you might be the kind of person who finds the answers someday." I drove home that day certain of something in a way I had not been certain of anything before. I told my mother at dinner. She listened carefully. Then she said that was a lovely direction for a community service project, but that I should also be thinking seriously about pre-med if I wanted to work in health, because being a doctor was a real career, and community health was what doctors did on weekends. I went to the University of Texas at Austin on a combination of scholarships and financial aid and money my mother had saved, which was a significant sacrifice given what she had been working with since my father's death, and I want to be clear that I have never forgotten what that sacrifice cost her. I studied public health for my first semester, which was not the field my mother had hoped for, but was the field I was certain about, and I thrived in it in the way you thrive, when you are doing the thing you are actually built to do. I had professors who excited me, and research projects that absorbed me, and the particular satisfaction of a person who is acquiring tools they already know they are going to use. My mother came to my college graduation in May of 1998, and she was proud and she said so. Then she asked what came next, and I told her I had been accepted to the Public Health Masters program at Johns Hopkins, and that I intended to specialise in community health systems. And her pride underwent a subtle revision that I recognised immediately because I had been watching it for 4 years. It did not disappear. It became complicated. She said Johns Hopkins was an excellent institution, which it is. She said she hoped I had a plan for the financial side, which was a reasonable question. And then she said the thing she said in the kitchen when I was 17, repeated in a slightly different register because I was older and closer to the reality of it. She said she wanted me to be sure I was choosing a field that would support a stable life, that helping people was a calling she respected, but callings did not pay mortgages. I told her I understood. I drove back to Austin, and I finished the semester, and I applied for and received a fellowship that covered most of my Hopkins tuition. And I moved to Baltimore in August, and started the program and did not look back, which is a phrase that is meant metaphorically, but in my case was also somewhat literal, because looking back required looking at my mother's face, and my mother's face in those years was a complicated thing to look at directly. Hopkins was the beginning of the real work, and the real work was not what I had expected it to be, which is not an unusual experience for graduate students, but was particularly disorienting in my case because what I had expected was a continuation of the certainty I had felt since 17. What I found instead was the complexity that lies underneath the certainty, the research disagreements, the methodological debates, the gap between what the literature said worked and what actually happened when you took an intervention into a real community with real constraints. I found it fascinating rather than discouraging, which told me I was in the right field, because the people who are in the wrong field find the complexity discouraging rather than fascinating. I worked with a professor named Dr. William Osey on a community health worker training program in Baltimore's East Side, and what I learned in that work shaped everything I have done since. I learned that the most effective health intervention is often not a new drug or a new technology, but a trained person from within the community who speaks the community's language, literally and figuratively, and who has the credibility that comes from shared experience. I learned that the system resists this kind of intervention because it is hard to patent and hard to scale, and does not produce the kind of measurable, short-term outcomes that funding cycles require. I learned that the people who do this work are very often women, who are very often underpaid and very often working in conditions that would be described as unsustainable if they happened in a hospital rather than a community centre. And I learned that changing those conditions required not just clinical expertise, but organisational capacity, which is to say the ability to build institutions that could sustain the work beyond individual grant cycles and individual champions. This was not what the community health woman who came to my school had told me when I was 17. But it was what the work actually required, and I was going to be the person who built that capacity. My first job after Hopkins was at a non-profit in Baltimore that trained community health workers for home visiting programs. The salary was $34,000 a year. I was 25 years old. I told my mother. She was quiet on the phone for long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she said, "Rachel, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to hear it as concern and not criticism." I said I would try. She said, "What is the plan?" $34,000 in Baltimore. You have student loans. You have no savings. Is this the beginning of a plan, or is this the plan? I told her it was the beginning. She said she hoped so. We got off the phone, and I sat on the floor of my small apartment with a window that faced the building next door, and I did not call her back for 2 days. Not out of anger, but because I needed 2 days to be certain that what I was doing was the beginning of something real, and not, as my mother suspected, a choice I was making that would eventually require rescuing. I was certain by the end of the second day. The certainty was not based on anything I could quantify yet. It was based on the work I was doing at the non-profit, which was the best work I had ever done, and on the feeling that I was building something in myself that would eventually become something external. The feeling was correct. The timeline was longer than I imagined when I was 25, because things always are. But the feeling was correct. The years between 25 and 32 were the years of building the internal architecture before the external one became visible. And they were not the years that make for a good surface narrative. I changed jobs twice, each time moving toward more responsibility and more focus on the organisational side of community health rather than the direct service side. I moved from Baltimore to Chicago and then from Chicago to Portland, following opportunities that were specific and intentional rather than wandering. I published 3 articles in peer-reviewed journals on community health worker training models. I built relationships with researchers and practitioners and funders and policy people who would later become the network the organisation depended on. I was underpaid for most of this period, relative to my educational credentials and relative to what people doing comparable work in clinical settings were earning. My mother knew the broad outlines of my career trajectory, but not the specific details, because our communication had settled into a pattern that was warm but surface level, monthly calls about family news and my brother Marcus's life and my grandmother's health and the logistics of holidays. And not much that went below the surface, because going below the surface required talking about the gap between my mother's expectations and my choices, and we had both decided, implicitly, to leave that gap undiscussed. The gap was real. We had simply agreed to live alongside it rather than through it. The organisation started in 2010 when I was 30 years old, with a grant of $60,000 from a small foundation in Portland that had been watching my work and believed, before I had fully articulated it myself, that what I was describing was a trainable and scalable model. The organisation's premise was simple in description and complicated in execution. We would develop a standardised curriculum for training community health workers, a curriculum that could be adapted for different community contexts while maintaining consistent core competencies, and we would train trainers, which meant that the organisation's capacity would multiply through the people it trained, rather than being limited to the direct work of a small staff. I did not have a business background. I learned what I needed to learn by doing it, and by finding people who knew what I did not know and asking them to teach me. I hired my first staff member, a woman named Delia, who had been a community health worker herself, and who understood the work from the inside in a way that my academic training had given me only partially. I rented office space in a converted warehouse in northeast Portland that was cheap and drafty, and exactly the right size for what we were in year 1. I called my mother and told her I was starting an organisation. She said that was ambitious. She did not say it was a mistake. The fact that she did not say it was a mistake was progress, and I recorded it as such. The first 3 years were defined by the tension between building and surviving, which is the tension that defines the first years of most organisations, and which is particularly acute in non-profits because the building and the surviving draw on the same resources. The grant we had received was enough to prove the model, but not enough to fund the model's growth, which meant that I was simultaneously doing the work, building the evidence base for the work, writing grant applications to fund the continuation of the work, and managing the organisation's operations, including payroll and compliance, and all of the administrative infrastructure that makes an organisation real rather than aspirational. Delia held down the programmatic side, while I held down everything else, and there were periods in year 2 when I was not certain we were going to make payroll, and I did not tell Delia, because telling her would have created anxiety that would have reduced her capacity to do the work that was going to save us. This was a management decision I made consciously, and which I am still not entirely sure was right, though it worked out. The second major grant came through in month 19, from a larger foundation that had been evaluating our model for a year, and when I saw the number in the award letter, 250,000 over 2 years, I sat at my desk in the drafty warehouse office and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel it. And then I called Delia and told her we were going to make it, and then I went back to work. My brother Marcus called me in the 4th year of the organisation to tell me that our mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Early stage, caught in a routine mammogram. Good prognosis. This was the full report he gave me, and he gave it in the precise and organised way that our mother had taught us both to communicate medical information, which is to say, leading with the essential facts and following with the context and the implications. I flew to Houston the next weekend. My mother was at the kitchen table when I arrived, with the same posture she had always had. Straight back, hands folded. The posture of a woman who has decided that the world does not get to see her, frightened even when she is. We talked about the diagnosis and the treatment plan and the logistics of who would be where and when. We did not talk about the 15 years of surface-level communication or the gap we had both been living alongside. But something shifted that weekend. I think because fear clarifies things that have been blurry, and being near my mother in the kitchen where she had stood when I was 17, and told me that helping people was not a plan. Being in that kitchen with her facing something real made the accumulated distance between us feel both more present and more resolvable than it had felt in a long time. She asked me about the organisation, not the surface version. She asked about the model, the training curriculum, the data we had on outcomes, the funding picture. Real questions, the kind you ask when you are genuinely curious, rather than politely maintaining a connection. I answered all of them. We talked for 3 hours. It was the longest real conversation we had had in 15 years. My mother's treatment went well. Surgery, radiation, monitoring. The standard progression of early-stage breast cancer, caught by a system that was working the way it is supposed to work. She came through it with the same composed determination she brought to everything. I was in Houston for a week during her surgery and recovery, and the week had a different quality from any week I had spent in that house since I was young. Part of the difference was that she needed me in a way she had not needed me as an adult, and needing changed the dynamic in ways that were unexpected and useful. Part of the difference was that I was able to be useful in ways she recognised. I managed the communication with her care team. I organised her medication schedule. I navigated the insurance paperwork. I spoke the health system's language on her behalf in a way that reduced her cognitive load during a period when she needed that load reduced. And I think part of the difference was that watching me work, watching me do the thing I'd spent 25 years building the capacity to do, in the service of the person who had doubted the capacity most clearly, recontextualised something for her. She did not say this directly. My mother rarely says the most important things directly. She says them through the quality of her attention, and the quality of her attention during that week was different from anything I had experienced from her as an adult. She was watching me the way she had watched me when I was a child. Before the divergence of expectations had created the distance, she was watching me with the undivided attention of someone who has decided that what they are seeing matters. The organisation's 5th year was the year everything changed in scale, and I want to describe this carefully, because scale changes are complicated, and the complications are not often discussed honestly. We received a multi-year federal grant that allowed us to expand from 3 states to 8. The expansion required hiring 23 new staff members in 18 months, which is a significant organisational challenge under any circumstances, and was particularly challenging because we were hiring in communities we had not previously worked in, where the relationship infrastructure that makes hiring decisions trustworthy takes time to build. I made mistakes in the expansion. 3 of the 23 hires did not work out, which is not an unusual ratio, but which was painful in each case, and instructive in ways that were not fun to learn from. The geographic expansion required me to be on the road more than I had been, which affected my relationships and my sleep, and my sense of rootedness in the way that extended travel always does, and which required me to develop a management approach that could sustain the organisation's culture in my absence. Delia was essential in this period. She had grown with the organisation in ways I had hoped for, but had not taken for granted, and by year 5 she was the Chief Programme Officer in title and in reality, And the organisation's programmatic quality in the new states reflected her ability to train people to our standard, without my direct involvement. I am telling you about the difficulties of the expansion, because I think the honest version of a growth story includes the difficulty. The version that presents growth as a series of escalating wins is not the version that is useful to people who are in the middle of growth and finding it complicated. My personal life during the organisation's building years deserves more than a passing reference, and I want to give it the attention it is owed. I was in a serious relationship from 28 to 33 with a man named David, who was a landscape architect, and who was, in most of the ways that matter, an excellent partner. He was supportive of the work in the abstract, and increasingly in conflict with the work in the concrete, because the work required my time and my attention in ways that left less of both for the relationship than it needed to thrive. We ended things with genuine mutual respect and genuine mutual sadness, which is the best version of an ending when ending is the honest thing. I dated occasionally in the years after David, with variable results and increasing appreciation for my own company, which is not resignation, but a real preference that I have found is common among people who do consuming work. I met my partner James 6 years ago at a conference on community health systems in Minneapolis. He is a paediatrician who works in community health clinics, which means he understands the work from his own angle and speaks a common professional language, which is more important than I had known it would be until I experienced it. We have been together 6 years. We live in the same house in Portland. We are, in the specific language of adults who have done a great deal of living before finding each other, extremely well suited. My mother has met him 4 times, and likes him in the direct and unguarded way she used to withhold from people I chose, which I take as evidence of the shift in our relationship that I have been trying to describe throughout this story. There is a conversation I have not told you about yet, and it is the conversation that belongs, I think, between the year my mother had cancer and the year I received the national award, because it is the conversation that made the award's meaning possible. It happened on a phone call in 2019, a Sunday evening in October, the kind of call that starts as routine and becomes something else without either person planning it. My mother had asked about the organisation's work in a new state we had entered, a state in the rural south where the community health worker model faced particular challenges related to funding and policy and the particular resistance of a health system that had not been built with community health workers in mind. I was describing the challenge in some detail, more detail than I usually gave her, because she had been asking better questions for several years by then, and the better questions warranted fuller answers. And then she said something that stopped me mid-sentence. She said, "You know, when you were 17 and you told me what you wanted to do, I didn't hear the vision. I heard the impracticality. I was wrong about which one mattered. I did not say anything for a moment." She continued. She said she had spent a great deal of time thinking about her father and her mother and the family they had built, and the choices they had made, and the things those choices had protected her from, and the things they had prevented her from seeing clearly. She said she understood now that what they had built was real and worth building, and that her inheritance from them was real, but that she had applied it too rigidly, had confused the form with the substance, had protected me from risk in a way that was actually protecting herself from the feeling of watching her daughter choose something she could not understand. She said all of this with the plainness of a woman who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at a conclusion that is true, even though it is uncomfortable. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Mum, I have always known you were trying to protect me. I just needed you to also trust me." She said she knew that now. We stayed on the phone for another hour. The 8,000 clients mark was not something I announced publicly. It appeared in our annual report in a table of cumulative program statistics, alongside other numbers that told the story of the organisation's reach. But the day I saw the number in proof before the report went to print, I sat with it for a long time. 8,000 people who had been trained as community health workers. 8,000 people who had gone back into their communities with tools and language and a framework for connecting their neighbours to the health system in ways that reduced emergency, room visits and improved chronic disease, management and increased preventive care utilisation, and, more than any of those measurable things, increased the sense in their communities that the health system was something that could be navigated rather than something that happened to you. The people who trained those 8,000 people were not primarily the organisation's staff. They were the trainers we had trained, The people who had gone through our curriculum and then applied it in their own communities with modifications and adaptations that were often improvements on what we had originally designed. This is what a training organisation looks like when it works. The impact is multiplicative rather than linear, and the multiplication happens through people who are mostly invisible in the headline numbers, because they are doing the work in places that do not generate press releases. I want those people to be visible in this story, even though I cannot name them individually. They are the substance of what has been built. My grandmother on my mother's side died in 2020 during the first year of the pandemic, which meant that her final months were defined by isolation and the particular grief of not being able to gather in the ways that death requires of the people left behind. She was 91. She had been a teacher for 35 years in East Texas. She had been the person in my family who had most consistently communicated to me over the course of my life that the thing I was doing was worth doing. Not always in words, which were not her primary language. She communicated through attention and through presence and through the specific quality of her listening, which had a weight to it that made you feel that what you were saying was being received and held. She knew the organisation. She had followed it through the years, through my mother's second-hand reports, and through her own reading when she could read, and through my own calls when she wanted direct information. When I visited her the year before she died, we sat on her porch in the afternoon, and she asked me about the people we had trained, specifically, not the numbers but the people, what they were like, what made them effective, what the work meant to them. I told her about several of them. She listened with the weight I am describing. Then she said she was glad I had not listened to the people who told me it could not be done, which was a reference I understood to mean my mother, and also, in a more complicated way, to herself, because she had contributed to the framework my mother brought to evaluating my choices, even if her application of it had been gentler. She said it in the way that honest old people say the hardest things, directly, without decoration, with the freedom that comes from having lived long enough to know which things matter and which ones do not. The pandemic years were the hardest years the organisation had faced, and also, in a certain light, the years that proved the model most clearly. Community health workers became nationally visible during COVID-19 in ways they had not been before, because the crisis made visible what those of us in the field had always known, that trusted local messengers are the most effective mechanism for getting health information to communities that do not trust institutional health systems, and that the distrust of institutional health systems is not irrational and has historical basis and cannot be overcome by better messaging alone. It can only be overcome by people. Our training model was suddenly relevant in a national conversation that had previously not known to include us. We received emergency funding. We were contacted by state health departments we had not worked with before. We adapted our curriculum rapidly for the specific context of pandemic response and trained several thousand additional health workers in 18 months. The organisation's staff went from 23 to 41 in a year. Managing that growth during a period when the whole world was also managing unprecedented conditions was the hardest operational challenge I have faced as a leader. And I did not manage it perfectly, and the imperfection cost us some things that I am still working to repair. But the organisation held. The model held, and the 8,000 people we had trained before the pandemic went into their communities during the crisis as people with training and trust and tools, and the effect of that preparation is measurable in the data and also visible in the stories that do not appear in the data but that I have been told by the community health workers themselves. I want to tell you about Yolanda, because Yolanda is the reason I gave the speech I gave at the award ceremony, and because she deserves to exist in this story by name. Yolanda Williams was a community health worker in rural Mississippi who went through our training program in 2016 and who, by the time of the pandemic, had built a network of 14 trained community health workers in her county that functioned as the primary COVID information and vaccination support, infrastructure in a county where the health department was understaffed and the distrust of the health system was historically grounded and deep. Yolanda had no formal health credentials before she came through our training. She had been a home health aide and a church deacon, and a woman who knew everyone in her county, and who was trusted by people who did not trust institutions. Our training gave her the framework and the vocabulary and the specific skills to convert that trust into health outcomes. She converted it into thousands of vaccinations in a community that the standard public health messaging could not reach. She is one of 8,000 people who went through our training program, each of whom has done something with that training in their own context. I mentioned her by name in my award speech because she is who the award is actually for. Not for me, not for the organisation's leadership, but for the 8,000 people who took what we offered them and went and did the work in places we could never reach directly. The senator who presented the award said afterward that my speech was the most honest speech he had heard at an award ceremony in years. I took that as a compliment, and also as a description of a low bar that I hope to help raise. The question of money is one I have been dancing around, and I want to address it directly because I think the honest version of a story about building something in the non-profit sector has to include the honest version of the financial reality. I did not get rich building this organisation. The organisation's finances are healthy, and I am compensated at a rate that is appropriate for an executive director of an organisation our size, which is to say considerably more than the $34,000 I made in Baltimore, and considerably less than what I might have earned in the corporate or consulting sector with my education and experience. I own my house outright after 15 years of payments. I have a retirement account that is adequate rather than generous. I have no significant debt. By the material standards my mother had in mind when she expressed concern about my career choices, I have not failed. I am not wealthy by the standards she probably imagined when she hoped for a daughter who became a doctor. I am by the standard that I apply to my own life, exactly where I should be, which is doing work that is fully aligned with what I believe matters, compensated at a level that is sustainable, living a life that I understand and have chosen, and continue to choose every time I could choose something else. My mother understands this better now than she did. She has said, in several different conversations over the last 5 years, that she had confused financial success with life success, which are correlated but not the same thing, and that watching me build over 2 decades had gradually revised her framework in ways she is still processing. The award dinner in Washington was the culmination of a nomination process that had begun without my knowledge. Delia had submitted the nomination and had managed to keep it from me for 4 months, which is a remarkable feat of organisational secrecy, given how small our staff is, and how much I am generally aware of what is happening in the building. When she told me I had been nominated, I was in her office for a regular check-in, and she handed me a folder and said I should read it. The nomination letter was 6 pages, written by Delia with contributions from several of our board members, and from programme partners, and from community health workers who had been through our training. I read it in her office, and I will not pretend I was not moved by it, because I was, and pretending otherwise would be the kind of false modesty that I find less honest than useful. What moved me was not the professional credentials listed or the organisational accomplishments summarised. It was the descriptions of impact from the community health workers themselves, the specific stories of what the training had meant in specific places, the language of people who had experienced something real and were describing it in the plain language of people who do not write nominations for a living and who therefore say what they actually mean. I called my mother the evening I found out I had won, and I told her the award was happening and that I wanted her to be there. She said she would book the flight that night. She had never attended a professional event of mine in 25 years of professional life. She booked the flight without asking any other questions. The night before the award ceremony, my mother and I had dinner at a restaurant in Georgetown, the 2 of us, which was something we had rarely done as adults, just the 2 of us, no occasion, no agenda, dinner as the point rather than as the container for something else. We talked about my grandmother, and about Marcus, and about James, and about a trip she was planning to visit a college friend in California. We talked about the organisation, and about the people we had trained, and about the policy landscape for community health workers, which she now understands with more detail and nuance than most people who are not professionally involved in the sector. And at the end of dinner, over dessert that she had ordered and I had declined and then eaten half of anyway, she said something that I want to record here because it belongs to this story, and I do not want to lose it. She said that when she had said helping people was not a plan, she had been afraid. That the fear had been dressed up as practical, wisdom, but that underneath it was fear. Fear that I would choose something that would not protect me the way she had needed to be protected, and had not been protected when my father died. She said the fear had been about her and her own experience, not about me and my actual situation. And she said she was sorry it had taken her 25 years to say that plainly. I said I appreciated the plainness. I told her that the fear made sense, and that I did not hold it against her, and that what I had needed was not for her to be without fear, but for the fear not to be the primary voice in our relationship. She nodded. We finished the dessert. We walked back to the hotel. It was a warm night for April, and the streets of Georgetown had the particular quality of a city that contains a great deal of history and is not entirely certain what to do with it, which I found appropriately atmospheric,